Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaye Tadalaye Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tata Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Yam Pravajantam Anupeta Apeta Krityam Rapayano Viraha Katara Ajuhava Putreti Tan Maitaya Taravo Binedus Tam Sarvabhutam Hridayam Munimanatosmi Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaivanarottamam Devim Sarasatam Vyasam Tato Jayamudirayat Bhaktya Vihina Parara Lakshay Kiptastakamari Tarangamadye Kripa Maitvam Sharanam Prapanna Vrinde Namaste Charanara Vindam Tave Vasmi Najivami Tvaya Vina Iti Vigyaya Radhe Tvam Nayanam Charanandike Vancha Kalpatarubhascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So we begin by offering our most humble, respectful obeisance unto the lotus feet of our beloved Gurus, unto Sri Guru Pada Padmanita Lita Bhavishta, Om Vishnupada Astotar Sat Sri Srimad Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada, and Sri Guru Pada Padmanita Lita Bhavishta, Om Vishnupada Astotar Sat Sri Srimad Bhaktivedanta Narayana Gosvami Maharaj, under our exalted Rupanuga Guru Varga, and all the assembled Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis. So, continuing on with the Sri Chaitanya Shikshamrita by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, written for the benefit of all humanity, but also specifically for those who have been practicing bhakti and have developed some faith, some enthusiasm, not only in scripture, but in the practice of bhakti, the aspiration for Raganuga bhakti. Right? And so now we're coming to the seventh rainfall, seventh out of eighth rainfall, deliberation on rasa. Now this, what is our eligibility? I mean, in the Madhurya Kadambini, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in the later chapters discussing Bhav Bhakti, when he introduces the subject of ras, he begins to describe it very similar way that Bhaktivinoda Thakur is doing. I mean, obviously Bhaktivinoda Thakur is following Srila Rupa Goswami, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. But he says that this can't really be understood until one comes onto the platform of Bhav Bhakti. And even then, it may take a number of lifetimes in Bhav Bhakti to actually understand this. So what is our eligibility here? Well, our eligibility is to hear about it and to aspire for it, to study it, to develop greed, to help mature our practice of bhakti, right? Understand bhakti in its depth, the seriousness of it, the distinctive nature, to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff being all of our anarthas, all of our material attachments, all of our material conceptions. And I remember hearing something from Srila Sridhar Maharaj many, many years ago, Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj, and he said that to his young followers at that time, that the way you see and understand things now at your stage in bhakti will be very different when you come to the Madhyam platform, right? What what Srila Prabhupada would call the second-class devotee. And even in Madhyam, there are gradations, right? We start out with Nishta, very fixed, determined in our service, But really, Madhyam begins when we begin to chant Shuddhanam and Ruchi, develop an actual taste for chanting the holy name and for all the practices in our bhajan. Right? But that when that matures even more, we begin to develop an awakening attachment for service to Radha and Krishna in a specific mood and following specific devotees. And asakti, deep attachment arises. And it's not realized, but it's beginning to awaken in the heart. And this is described in Jaiva Dharma when Vijay Kumar and Brajanath are disclosing their confidential feelings to Raghunath Das Babaji Maharaj. And he confirms them and then gives them instruction about how to meditate and bring that realization into their heart in a much deeper way. And so they're making the transition from asakti into bhav bhakti. Right? But even then, and that's the Ekadash bhavs, the 11 aspects or elements of our spiritual identity, our service, our relationships in the spiritual world, right? But then they continue to chant, they continue to serve and hear, and then they go to Puri. And with the encouragement of Raghunath Das Babaji Maharaj, they go to hear from Gopal Guru Goswami, very famous personality, associate of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu when he was a young boy, right? And he gives them further instruction in this Ekadash Bhav. When their Bhav Bhakti begins to awaken even more, he gives them further and further instruction. So at every stage, in the Madhyam stage, in the Uttam stage, there are many gradations, right? But it begins by hearing. I mean, this is, we have to hear about those higher levels. Otherwise, what do we aspire for? How do we distinguish between the affairs and the pleasures of this world and what our actual spiritual opportunities are? So, in this book, Chaitanya Shikshamrita, in Jaiva Dharma, in Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's book, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu Bindu, he gives a kind of short summary of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and he also describes this conception of Ras in a very similar way. Can we fully grasp it? No. No. But we can hear it with respect and honor and then begin to become very serious and focused in our practice of bhajan so that one day we may enter into this. So, with that in mind, and not trying to overstep our eligibility or boundaries, I mean, I have no qualification to speak about these subject matters in depth. I can just repeat what Bhaktivinoda Thakur is saying. So, he begins in this first stream of the seventh rainfall, deliberation on Ras. He begins by saying that Ras is eternal. What is Ras? Oh, and just one more thing. If this makes you uncomfortable to hear this, then don't listen to this, right? You know, hear and read something else. But if you're curious and, you know, this is something you'd be interested in, then lend your ears. What is Ras? Bliss is Ras, composed of ecstasy, is an eternal and indestructible phenomena. Let me read that again. I read it wrong. What is Ras? Bliss is Ras. Ras, composed of ecstasy, is an eternal and indestructible phenomenon. There may be a doubt that if Ras arises when Bhav is cultivated or stimulated, then Ras could not have existed before the awakening of Bhav. And upon the instigation of Bhav being finished, then Ras will also disappear. Therefore, how can it be accepted that Ras is eternal? The answer is that the Ras that we are going to discuss here is unlimited and without beginning. anadi. Correct. It's important. And think about this. This is the splendor of the Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy and conceptions, that every religion talks about God in some degree or other, love of God. But what is that love? How do we understand it? How is it distinguished from the ordinary love of this world? Most people can't distinguish it. They have no idea of the supra-mundane nature of spiritual love. Neither the object of that love, the abode of that love, the nature of that love. Here we're going to understand it in its different elements. So the ingredients of ras are also eternal. The ingredients of ras are sthayi bhav. That's one's permanent ecstatic emotion, like dasiras, sakiras, vatsalya, shringar, right? Vibhav, the causes of bhav. Anubhav, 13 subordinate signs of ecstatic emotions that are manifest externally. And vyabhichari bhav, or sanchari bhav, 33 temporary emotions that arise and fall within the ocean of sthayi bhav. So if our fixed sentiments, the way in which we love and relate with Krishna as a friend, or as a parent, as a beloved, we have an identity, and that is the mood that is fixed and predominates in the way that we interact and serve. The vyabhichari bhavs are transitory emotions, right? That come and go. And so the sthayi bhavs, like the ocean, and the transitory emotions are like waves that come up. Anyway, that's described in Jaiva Dharma also, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about it here. And anubhav, these are the external manifestations in the body, right? Vibhav, the causes of bhav, that's, actually I'm not going to speak here. I know he's going to unpack it, so. These 4 ingredients of ras are also eternal, as is their mutual relationship. Wherever there is a spiritual object or entity, eternal ras must also be present. Just as the spiritual form of Bhagavan, the individual jiva, and the Vaikuntha planets are eternal, ras is also eternal. In the Taittiriya Upanishad, the absolute truth has been declared as Ras Swarup, the embodiment of ras. Raso vai saha rasam hi evayam labhavanandi bhavati. The absolute truth is full of ras. And when the jiva attains him, he actually becomes transcendently blissful. That's from the Taittiriya Upanishad. Many people have the opinion that the Upanishads only describe the impersonal feature of the Lord. And indeed, there are impersonal descriptions of that aspect of the Absolute. Right? But wherever that is described or referenced, there are other references to the personal feature, for which the Brahman feature is an aspect of. Right? What is it? Vadanti tattva vidas tattvam yaj jnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti shabdite. Right? That absolute truth is realized in 3 features according to the eligibility of the practitioner as Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan. But in its highest feature, personality of Godhead, the very form of ras, love, bliss, whom we have that ras-filled relationship with. So the ras that the jiva achieves when prem is attained is eternally present, along with prem itself. This awakens only within qualified jivas. The appearance of the eternal relationship between Bhagavan and the jiva is itself the awakening of Ras. So we have to become qualified. Now he's going to describe material Ras. This is very important because we have to be able to distinguish between the mundane, that which is related to the body and the mind and the false ego, and the emotions and qualities of the soul and its relationship with God, right? So ordinary poets and writers have also described one type of ras, but this is material ras, right? Material love, right? Because of being bound by matter, the jiva becomes covered with the subtle material body. The subtle body consists of 4 ingredients: heart, or consciousness, chitta. That's the most subtle form of consciousness that's covered, right? It's the essential quality of the soul, consciousness, but that chitta refers to consciousness that's still covered by material energy. False ego, ahankara. Aham means me, hakara means the doer, or the purusha, that false conception, right? And that which directs that identity towards the gross and subtle body. Intelligence, buddhi, and mind, man. Okay, so that's the subtle body. Chitta, ahankara, buddhi, and man. These are material and separate in constitution from the soul itself. The conditioned soul, the Buddha jiva, after being covered by these 4 subtle material ingredients, begins to identify itself with them. And now, through false ego, the jiva identifies with the material body. It considers itself to be either male or female, and by the material intelligence, thinks in terms of what is materially beneficial or detrimental for that body. By the heart, the chitta, it feels happiness or distress, and by the mind, it gains knowledge of material objects and meditates upon them. Are these 4 items new acquisitions that the jiva attained after becoming bound in matter? Or were they in fact already present within him in a pure seed form? The answer is that they are not new to the jiva. The jiva, who is a completely spiritual entity, in his pure constitutional state, is possessed of the self-conception that, quote, I am a particular servant of Bhagavan who is possessed of name, form, and qualities. So what is the Mula Shloka, the root shloka of all Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy? And Jivera Swarupaya Krishnera Nityadas, right? I am a servant of Bhagavan, right? That's where it all begins. And of course, that's where it's eternal as well. But when we awaken that conception, that determination, and the aspiration to realize that in the deepest, most profound and ecstatic way, then we're on our path, right? So Bhaktivinoda Thakur is describing in a very beautiful way the ecstasy of spiritual life and the distinction between that which we've taken as our self and as our greatest prospect, right? You know, the limited prospects of this material world, which ultimately conclude in death. And then many people don't know anything beyond that. But even for those who are aware of the samsara cycle, repeated birth and death, that's no relief. I mean, you know, when I think about being born again, I get a little terrified, actually, because I'm claustrophobic. And I think, oh my God, being stuck in that womb again, in that dark, confined place, scrunched up, can't see, hearing muffled sounds. I mean, the descriptions in the Bhagavatam are kind of horrifying of what it's like for the jiva in that state, right? And then again and again and again, and all the attachments and affection and relationships that we develop, and then they're all gone. We've had so many of those, and in this life we think about all those people that we're attached to and that are dear to us. And the thought of losing them is very sad. And when you get older, our friends begin to disappear one by one. And in the not too distant future, we will also leave this body and be gone. And everybody that we knew and were attached to, we won't remember, and they won't remember us. And then we start all over again. Over and over and over. So, this pure spiritual identity or ego, that I'm a servant of Krishna, took shelter of the pure spiritual form of the soul. There was also an intelligence that took shelter of the pure swarup of the jiva, by which the jiva could understand what was beneficial and detrimental, and through which he could perceive bliss. There was also a pure mind, which enabled him to understand and meditate upon other objects, other jivas, and Bhagavan. After becoming bound by matter, these pure spiritual tendencies, being grossly and subtly transformed in relation to matter, now manifest in a worldly and impure manner. Thus, the spiritual ras that had taken shelter of the pure state of the soul is now manifesting in a perverted and impure form due to taking shelter of matter. Materialistic poets have called this impure emotion love. So what we know as love, affection, joy, all these different emotions that we have in this world that we aspire for are what's called in Jaiva Dharma vitiated or impure, degraded, perverted forms of the pure experience. Sometimes we hear about Krishna with intelligence and mind and these qualities. And I didn't necessarily know what to do about this. But these are aspects of the completeness of the personality of God and the functions of the soul, of the being. So we have these functions, which we call intelligence, which we call mind, right? So just to go over those again, an intelligence by which we can understand what's beneficial and what's detrimental. That's the function of intelligence. So we're trying to inform ourselves so that we know what is generally beneficial and what is detrimental. People in this world are madly chasing after some kind of experience of happiness or love, but because they're uninformed, they use their intelligence in the wrong way. And they chase after these ephemeral things that actually are going to cause them great harm. Certainly physically now in this life, mentally in this life, but also in terms of karmic reaction. Right? So impure intelligence. So we're reading all of this to inform our intelligence so that we can have the strength to direct ourselves to higher, spiritually purposeful actions. Right? So intelligence by which we can understand what is beneficial and detrimental. And through, therefore, what we can perceive as bliss, right? And then the pure mind, by which we can understand and meditate upon other objects, other jivas, and Bhagavan. That's the function. Our mind in this world is like the sixth sense, and it's just the focal point of all the knowledge-acquiring senses. they focus on the mind, and this is what we see and perceive in this world, and we meditate on these things. Right? And by meditating on these different objects, what happens? We develop attachment for them. This is the whole Bhagavad Gita. Kodad bhavati sammoha. Right? That by meditating on these things with the false conception that I'm this body and that these are objects of my enjoyment, uninformed intelligence, not knowing, then we focus on these things, and we see them as and relate to them. Oh, I like this, I don't like that. I want this, I don't want that. So our pure spiritual tendency to relate with Bhagavan and to engage in loving exchanges with him becomes perverted by false ego, which directs everything to the body and the senses and the mind and the impure intelligence, and we see all these things and we chase after them, thinking that that's what's going to give us happiness. And that pure mind, the impure mind, just engages us like that. So, what is the difference between spiritual and material ras? There is only one substance called ras. In its eternal state, it is composed of eternal bliss, Nityananda Swarup. And in the conditioned state, that is bound by matter, it is composed of material happiness or material distress. Ooh, okay. So we have spiritual ras, we have material ras. Spiritual ras in the eternal pure state, Nityananda Swarup, pure bliss. Right? But when we're bound by matter, when we're buddha jivas, then what we know as ras is the material happiness, material distress, right? The threefold miseries, adhyatmic, adhidaivic, adhibodhic. Thus, the names, relationships, activities, and results that are characteristic of material ras and that have been described by materialistic writers and poets are all present in a pure form in spiritual ras. There's no difference between material ras and spiritual ras. They can only be differentiated by their nature. The spiritual ras, chit ras, is eternal, while material ras is temporary. And chit ras is glorious, while material ras is contemptible. The shelter, the ashraya of spiritual ras, is the pure jiva. And its object, Vishaya, is Bhagavan. The object, Vishaya, of material ras is insignificant bodily beauty, and its shelter is the material consciousness. While chit ras is intrinsically composed of bliss, material ras is composed of material happiness and distress. So he's making the point that, that ras itself is eternal, but when it becomes transformed by connection with matter, it becomes misdirected and vitiated or degraded or perverted, right? So he gives a number of verses now, which are supporting that conception. So he quotes Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, 7th chapter. I'm not going to read all the Sanskrit here because there's a bunch of verses that will take longer. So, Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, 7th chapter, 11th verse. Jata jale chandramasha kampadish tatkrito guna. Just as the moon reflected on water appears to tremble and also be composed of water, but in fact the moon does not tremble at all. it is the water that does so. In the same way, the material qualities of hankering and lamentation that have been superimposed upon the soul are also false. Mistakenly seeing something which is not is known as vivart, and it is the cause of inauspiciousness for the jiva. Examples of such contrary or false understandings are seeing a rope as a snake or a mother of pearl as real silver. So seeing something which is not, vivart. There's a spiritual vivart, prem vivart, where being so illusioned by love, one may mistake one's situation. Highest Ramananda Roy refers to that in the later stages of the 8th chapter of Madhya-lila. And when he's about to sing a song about it that he composed, Mahaprabhu puts his hand over the mouth of Ramananda Roy, which sort of indicates that not now. It's very high subject matter. Don't reveal this at this point. But we know the prime example we're given is when Radhika at Prem Sarovara sitting on Krishna's lap, and a bee is disturbing her, and Madhumangal takes a stick and chases that bee away, and then says, "Oh, Madhusudan," which is the name for a bumblebee, "I've chased him away, he'll never return." Madhusudan is also a name of Krishna. He's like a bee tasting the nectar of the love between himself and the gopis. And so when she hears Madhusudan has been chased away and will never return, she experiences prem vivart, which is that even though she's sitting on Krishna's lap, she thinks he's far away and will not return, and she's plunged into this ocean of incredible separation while sitting on his lap. And Krishna sees this and he's astonished. And then there's a whole pastime that comes from that, right? Whole spiritual understanding. But in this case, this vivart is the, I lost my place here. This vivart is when, let me get back to it here. Right, where we misconstrue both the Vishaya and the Ashraya. We're the Ashraya of love and affection, and Krishna is the object of our love, right? When we direct it towards him. But when that becomes transformed, right, then we direct that love towards our own self. Not our own self, but our own misconstrued sense of self, the body, right? And the bodily beauty and the happiness we can get through the body by my strength, by my knowledge, by my, beauty, by my fame, all of the 6 qualities that Krishna has, we have them in a very teeny-weeny way, and we direct them towards ourself. And this is insignificant, right? And the shelter of it is material consciousness. And so he gives the example of when we see the moon reflected in water. It looks like it's in the water. It looks like it's made of water. And it looks like the movements of the water are the movements of the moon. But it's not. The moon is independent and separate. Then he gives a quote from the 11th chapter of 11th canto. Now Krishna is instructing Uddhava. A bewildered and foolish living entity, embodied within the body, created by his previous fruitive activities, due to the false ego of thinking that the actions performed with the bodily senses are actually performed by him, remains bound. Actions of the bodily senses. And we do think that, right? Even with some knowledge, we're bound by that. Then again, 3rd canto, 30th chapter, 4th verse. The living entity in whatever species of life he appears, finds material pleasure in that species. He is never averse to being situated in such a condition. Just see the bewilderment caused by the deluding potency of Maya. That's an extraordinary statement. Whatever body that you happen to be embodied in, well, then you are convinced that that's me, and you're seeking happiness in that. That's all you know. And even insects and worms, and they're all seeking the same thing, right? They're just some kind of relationship with other living entities to exchange ras, which means mostly sex life. That's the highest ras in the material world. In the human form of life, you can experience ras in appreciating the aesthetics, right, of music, of art, of things like that, but it's still binding you to the things of this world, right? And to the self-identification. Oh, I'm an artist, or I'm a scholar, right? I'm a musician, right? And we enjoy the more subtle things of this world, but we're still bound, right? We remain bound, thinking that these things are actually performed and experienced by us. But they're just the interaction of the material elements with our material senses imposed on the mind that's this limited consciousness, chitta, limited intelligence, thinks that, okay, this is my reality. And we become satisfied. Even the hogs, remember that story of Lord Indra, right? Lord Indra, being cursed, had to take the body of a hog, and for a long time he was enjoying now as the king of the hogs. And he had so many wives, so many children, and when Lord Brahma thought, oh, we've got to bring him out of that state. And when he came to him and he began to speak with him, he said, actually, you're not a hog, you're Lord Indra, and you have to go back to the heavenly planets and perform your role and, protect the demigods and, all that. And he said, no, what are you talking about? I'm very happy here. I'm the king of all these hogs. I have so many wives, I have so many children, I have all the food I want, detestable things that hogs eat. And he refused to go. And then Lord Brahma threatened him. I think he killed all his wives and children. He said, that's all right, I'll get more. And then did something else, and then Indra, as the hog, became enraged and charged at him, right, in such illusion. And then Lord Brahma sprinkled water from his kamandalu on him and transformed him back to Indra. And then in that state, oh my God, what was I thinking? What was I doing? And yet, even the body of a demigod is bound by the limited self-conception. Of course, Indra now is awakened. I'm a devotee. I have my duty to Bhagavan. But even the demigods are conditioned by their identity as demigods. Not all. Some may be pure devotees, but we see Indra being afflicted many times. It's a great lesson for us. We don't condemn him in any way. That's not our intent or purpose. It's instructive for us. So whatever species of life you think this is great, the birds, the bees, everybody's running around. And then in that same chapter of the third canto, thus a man of uncontrolled senses and bewildered intelligence, who is completely absorbed in ties to his family members, dies with great suffering, surrounded by his weeping family members. He becomes unconscious and gives up his material body. In the West, we're often separated from that experience of death nowadays. In the old days, everybody's living together from the time they were born to the time they died. And we don't always see that. In India, though, it's still right there. In our first house in Bangalore, in Baseshwar Nagar, next door to us, we had this family living there. And there was a man in charge of the family. He was an angry, kind of a mean fellow. And he became sick, ill. And he was in a lot of pain. We would hear him in the house just moaning, oh, oh. Then one day they just put him out in the driveway. They were just tired of him yelling and hollering. And we came to understand that this man had been very cruel to his wife and his children, everybody, all the relatives. And now they just didn't want anything to do with him. They had no sympathy towards him, even in his suffering state. And time to time they'd come out and yell at him and beat him. Be quiet, you're disturbing everybody. And this went on for weeks, right? And he's just out there in constant pain, just moaning and crying, and nobody to help him. The only interactions he got were beatings. Finally, he died. And what happened? They put a little pandal over him. Everybody came, and all night long they were weeping. Oh, I don't know if they were really weeping. Sometimes they hire people to come and cry and weep over the body because nobody has any feelings and they don't want to just, completely neglect the person. Or maybe, all right, yeah, he was a rat, a rascal, but now he's gone. He was my husband. Just see the delusion. No matter how unhappy that person made them, now he's gone. Oh, and they're lamenting. So, material rasa, composed of material happiness and distress. In describing the science of rasa, there is no necessity of taking assistance from metaphorical or indirect meanings, the lakshana vritti. The endeavor to understand rasa tattva will be successful only by taking the direct interpretations, abhidha vritti, of the verses of the scriptures. If it were not so, then the book Srimad Bhagavatam would not have been described, or would not have described the supreme rasa completely in the form of the pastimes of Krishna. All right, so make note that the Bhagavatam and the scriptures are describing rasa in its pure and real form. And it's incumbent upon us not to impose our mundane conceptions of life and rasa and love upon those pastimes, to accept them as they are. And even in the 10th canto, Shukadeva Goswami is so careful to preface these descriptions so many times by describing Krishna as Sri Bhagavan, right? And to describe and make special note about the quality of the love of the gopis, over and over and over, and the praise of the demigods, and the personified Vedas and everybody. That same Krishna who is now taking birth is that Supreme Personality of Godhead, the source of all the incarnations, the source of all material and spiritual worlds, over and over. So, direct interpretation or understanding of the verses of the scripture. If it were not so, then the book Srimad Bhagavatam would not have described the supreme rasa completely in the form of the pastimes of Krishna. In this material world, poets have described the perverted material reflection of the pure rasa, which exists in the conjugal affection between a man and his beloved, in the behavioral dealings between a father and his son, in the mutual conduct between two friends, and between a master and his servant. Transcendental rasa in its pure stage, as well as all of its characteristics, essential ingredients, rules of engagement, and modus operandi, have thus been revealed to the conditioned souls in a perverted manner through these mundane descriptions. Rasa is a self-manifesting entity. If it were not so, then who could have produced it? Even though these are all perverted transformations of real bliss, Paramananda, pure Chit Rasa has still briefly revealed her nature, qualities, and all her characteristics in this world through descriptions of material ras in order to bestow auspiciousness upon the conditioned jivas. Thus, there is no difficulty in taking advantage of the direct presentation of the subject of ras that is given in the Srimad Bhagavatam. In the Jaiva Dharma, the same subject is described by the question of Brajanath to Raghunath Das Babaji Maharaj. He's saying, when he's describing the holy name and describing these different elements of spiritual reality, he's saying, well, how can we understand these things if all we have is the material objects and experiences to relate to? These are mundane, they're not spiritual. You're saying there's a distinction. And Babaji Maharaj says, yes, that's true, but it's all we have. And so we use them to assist us to a certain extent. They can give us a window towards that reality. And that's what we have. But a window informed by separating the inebrieties of the material with the spiritual, right? They're trying to separate the idea that the goal of all of this is me. We come to understand by studying the Bhagavatam, and when you study, really, we understand Bhagavatam, we have to read Chaitanya Charitamrita, and you read that 8th chapter, this Ramananda Roy Samvad, and Srila Prabhupada's purports so clearly illuminate that real love is selfless. In other words, it's not self-directed. It's completely pure in that as the ashraya, as the abode of love, the highest persons who have that quality are the gopis, and they have no self-interest. Their only desire is to make Krishna happy. Whatever has to be done, if it makes Krishna happy, then that's their only motive. And yet, ironically, even though they're not pursuing their own happiness, they become the recipients of the greatest joy and the greatest happiness. Sometimes to the point where it even interferes with their service, when they become stunned and unable to move, or when their eyes become so filled with tears they can't see Krishna. And they condemn the Creator. Oh, who has created these eyes with eyelids or with tears that prevent us from seeing Krishna? Who has made us and this body stunned so we can't serve? But that is, why is that? Why do they get that? Because Krishna, who is their object of love, the abode of Ras, he becomes so overjoyed with their selflessness, with their love for him, that he's competing to reciprocate, and he gives all his love. They become the object of his love. He becomes the ashraya of love for them, and they become his vishaya. This is described in that Bhakti Samrita Sindhu Bindu that I was referencing, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, which is amazing to think. But it makes sense, and it makes us understand and appreciate the pastimes where everything they do, even when they appear to be jealous and angry and creating obstacles for each other's pleasure to meet, it's all to increase each other's love. Everything is done for that. So he's explaining this here, that we can read the Bhagavatam, and even though we have an incomplete understanding because our only reference is the material, still by the descriptions of the Bhagavatam, we can develop a more and more clear vision of that. And as you mentioned earlier, as we progress through different levels of bhakti and our consciousness becomes more and more uncovered, the anarthas begin to fall away, then greater and greater understanding comes. And that's what we see in Jaiva Dharma by describing the life stories of these different kinds of devotees Lahiri Mahashaya, the gold merchant couple, Brajanath and Vijay Kumar, and many others, right? We begin to understand the progress and their different capacities to understand and absorb these teachings. So those who hear about Ras and desire to awaken their own spiritual Ras, that's us, right? Chit Ras, should remember not to allow the despicable nature of material Ras to enter into their practice. Some false groups, Apasampradayas, under the guise of producing spiritual Ras, resort to material Ras. This is most detestable and an abominable thing. By resorting to this, there is a great chance that the jiva will repeatedly fall down. It is one's duty to awaken the feeling of Ras only within the spiritual body, Siddha Deha of the jiva. This Ras will never awaken in relation to this material body. So that's the constant warning. I remember one time we were in India during Brajmandal Parikrama, and some young girls had decided to do a play based on one of the stories in the Chamatkara Chandrika by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, 4 Ras-filled blissful stories. And this one story was about how Radhika was in such separation that she was bitten by the snake of that separation from Krishna, right? And her Sakis, in order to cure her, knew that only if she met Krishna could this be resolved and she could be brought back to life, to consciousness. And so they devised a plot. And so Krishna comes disguised as one of the daughters of Garga Rishi, who knows the art of curing snake bite. Because they propose, the gopis tell Jatila that, oh, she's been bitten by a snake, she's going to die. And so they call this girl, Krishna comes disguised. It's a beautiful play, beautiful story. And because Jatila had prevented Radhika even from leaving the house and not even able to go and cook for Krishna, right? So she was in that kind of separation. So actually, Jatila appears to be a foe, an opponent of Radhika, but actually, by this clever pastime, by Yoga Maya, she's acting as the adversary, but it creates an opportunity for Krishna and the clever gopis to arrange for a meeting at Yavat itself that could never have taken place otherwise. So Jatila, she's actually, you can never think of her in the mundane way as an evil adversary or someone possessed of demoniac mentality. She has such deep love for Radhika and wants Radhika's happiness, but has this mentality to protect her chastity, to protect her reputation, right? So for her, Krishna becomes an opponent or a foe. So she sets up these obstacles. But at the end of the story, we don't have time to tell the whole story, when this beautiful Brahmini girl cures her beloved daughter-in-law, she insists that they stay together that night. They embrace each other, go take the meal, and be happy together in Radhika's own room. Right? So it's a very sweet story. But these girls who did the play, they were kind of young and undeveloped in their bhakti. And so in certain elements of the story, they're describing things, and it was, unfortunately, their mundane conceptions of Radha and Krishna were coming out. It was a little lusty, right? And, that happens. We all go through growth. Nice girls, and they've grown up since, But Srila Narayana Maharaj, after the play, a little dissatisfied, and he gave them a warning that you should be very careful about how you portray these things and what you choose to portray. If you don't have proper understanding, you'll make it material, sahaja, prakrita sahaja, impose mundane mentalities onto these pure and beautiful spiritual pastimes. And I'd seen him more than once. And this is the, informing people about these things. I myself was the object of this kind of chastisement one time. Very beneficial to get that, to put us on the right track, not to confuse our mundane sentiments with the pure interactions and relationships of Krishna and his devotees, or even between the devotees themselves. Right? So Bhaktivinoda Thakur is giving us a very good introduction here. And he's going to go on to explain this. Tomorrow he's going to talk about the person qualified for this transcendental ras. All right? What is spiritual ras? What is material ras? What is the relationship between them? And then what makes us qualified to understand or pursue spiritual ras? So we'll stop here, and we'll continue this tomorrow. Okay. So let me turn this off.